There is a spice sitting in your kitchen right now that was once worth more than gold. Not in some poetic, metaphorical sense. Literally, weight for weight, the black peppercorns in your cabinet would have, at certain points in European history, bought you land, settled debts, and ransomed prisoners of war. And that single fact, that a dried berry from a vine on the other side of the world could hold such extraordinary power over the imaginations and economies of an entire civilization, explains everything that followed. It explains the ships, it explains the routes, it explains the disappearances. To understand why so many vessels vanished on their way to India, you first have to understand what was driving them there in the first place. Because no one sends a ship into unknown and deadly waters for idle curiosity. They do it because something on the other side is so valuable, so desperately needed, that the mathematics of loss somehow still come out in favour of trying, and, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the thing on the other side was not just pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg and cloves, it was survival, economic, political, and in the minds of the men who made these decisions, perhaps even civilizational. The medieval spice trade was one of the most complex and profitable commercial systems the ancient world had ever constructed, and it had been running, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years before the Portuguese ever pointed a ship south along the African coast. The routes themselves were old beyond reckoning, overland roads and sea channels that threaded through Arabia, Persia, the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, funneling the products of India and the islands of Southeast Asia into the markets of the Mediterranean. Spices moved from the growers in Kerala and the Moluccas through Arab and Indian middlemen, then through Persian traders, then through the merchants of Alexandria and Constantinople and Venice, each layer, adding cost, each hand that touched the cargo extracting profit, until by the time a bag of nutmeg arrived on a stall in Bruges or London, it had passed through perhaps a dozen different economies and travelled 10,000 miles. Pepper was the currency of everyday commerce in a way that is almost impossible to fully appreciate today. It was used not only as a flavouring but as a preservative. In an age before refrigeration, the ability to mask the taste of aging meat and delay its spoilage was genuinely life-preserving. Cinnamon was used in medicine as much as in cooking, believed to cure everything from indigestion to the plague. Cloves were chewed for toothache and burned as incense. Nutmeg, which came only from the tiny Banda Islands in what is now Indonesia, was believed to ward off pestilence, and during plague years the demand for it became almost hysterical. And all of these things, every last one of them, had to come from somewhere that was not Europe, along routes that Europe did not control. This dependence on Eastern goods was not simply a matter of taste or luxury. For the great merchant cities of the Mediterranean, Venice above all, but also Genoa, Pisa, and the trading republics that rose and fell around them, the spice trade was the engine of their entire economic existence. The Venetians had built an empire not of land but of commerce, and the beating heart of that empire was access to Eastern markets. They maintained consulates in Alexandria, negotiated with Mamluk sultans, and ran an extraordinarily sophisticated network of trading ships, the famous Galere da Mercato, whose schedules and routes were planned by the Venetian Senate itself. The profits from spice imports funded the art of the Renaissance, the churches, the palaces, the entire glittering surface of Italian civilization. When people talk about what built Venice, the honest answer is pepper. But then, in 1453, something happened that shook the foundations of this entire system. The Ottoman Turks, under the young Sultan Mehmed II, brought his army and his enormous bronze cannons to the walls of Constantinople, and in the early morning hours of May 29th, after a siege of nearly 2 months, the city fell. The last Christian emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI, died in the final defence, either killed in the fighting or deliberately casting aside his imperial regalia and plunging into the battle to die as a common soldier. Accounts differ, and the mystery of his final moments has never been fully resolved. But what was not in dispute was the consequence. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the Bosphorus, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and the entire overland network of trade routes that had carried Eastern goods into Europe for centuries was now either blocked or subject to Ottoman taxation and control at a level that made the old Venetian profits essentially unsustainable. The Ottomans did not immediately shut down all trade. They were sophisticated enough to understand that taxing commerce was more profitable than eliminating it, but the terms changed dramatically, and the uncertainty was in many ways as damaging as outright prohibition. European merchants could no longer simply count on reliable access to Eastern goods through established channels. The routes that had functioned since antiquity were now contested, expensive, and politically fraught in new and dangerous ways. And into this anxiety, this economic panic dressed up in the language of Christian crusade and geographical curiosity, stepped the Kingdom of Portugal. Portugal was, by the standards of the great European powers, a small country. It sat at the extreme western edge of the continent, pressed between Spain and the Atlantic, with a coastline that faced outward toward the open ocean in a way that was simultaneously its greatest limitation and its greatest opportunity. It had no Mediterranean ports. It had no established connections to the overland spice routes. It was, in the commercial geography of the late medieval world, something of a backwater. But it had the sea, and it had, through a combination of historical accident, genuine intellectual curiosity, and the driven obsession of one particular royal dynasty, developed a tradition of maritime exploration that was without parallel in the Western world. The man most responsible for launching Portugal's age of exploration was not himself an explorer. Prince Henry, known to later history as Henry the Navigator, a title that was actually invented centuries after his death by an English historian, since he personally sailed very little, was the third son of King John I, born in 1394, and from an early age he became fixated on two things: the nature of the African coastline and the possibility that it could be circumnavigated. His motivations were a mixture of the practical and the mystical, as was common for men of his era. He wanted trade routes. He wanted to find the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, believed to exist somewhere in Africa or Asia. He wanted to strike at Islam from the rear, and he wanted, perhaps more than anything, to know what was beyond the horizon. Henry established what amounted to the first systematic research program in the history of European exploration. Not quite a school, as the legend of the School of Sagres has been somewhat embellished over the centuries, but certainly a community of cartographers, astronomers, pilots, and shipbuilders who gathered at his court and pooled their knowledge about the sea. Under his sponsorship, Portuguese captains pushed steadily down the African coast year by year through the early and middle decades of the 15th century. Cape Bojador, long considered the end of the navigable world, it had a reputation among sailors as the point beyond which ships could not return, where the ocean boiled and sea, monsters waited, was finally rounded in 1434 by a captain named Gil Innes, who found to his relief that the ocean on the other side was perfectly ordinary water. But the psychological barrier had been enormous, and the crossing of it opened everything that came after. By the time Henry died in 1460, Portuguese ships had reached Sierra Leone and were pushing into the Gulf of Guinea. The project he'd begun continued under subsequent Portuguese kings, driven by the same combination of commercial desperation and genuine curiosity that had animated him. King Joan II, who came to the throne in 1481, was particularly determined. He reorganised the administration of the African trade routes that Portugal had established, extracted the maximum profit from the gold and slave trade at São Jorge da Mina on the Gold Coast, and pressed the exploration southward with renewed urgency. It was under his direction that the real prize, the route around Africa to India, finally began to come within reach. The ships that Portugal was using for this work were themselves a product of centuries of Mediterranean and Atlantic sailing experience, refined and adapted for deep ocean voyaging in ways that represented genuine technological achievement. The Caravel, which had been the primary exploration vessel for much of Henry's era, was a relatively small, manoeuvrable ship with lateen, triangular, sails that allowed it to sail close to the wind, an essential capability for exploring coastlines and making headway against contrary winds. But as the distances involved grew, and as the commercial ambitions of the voyagers expanded, a larger type was needed. The No, a round-hulled three-masted carrack design that could carry more cargo and more men, that was more stable in open ocean conditions, but that was also heavier and less responsive than the caravels that had preceded it. The tension between these two types, the nimble explorer and the heavy merchant vessel, would define the entire history of the India route, because the same ocean that demanded large, sturdy ships also had a way of punishing the characteristics that large, sturdy ships inevitably possessed. What no one fully understood yet, As the 15th century reached its final decades and the Portuguese preparations for the great southward push intensified, was just how different the Southern Ocean would prove to be from anything European sailors had encountered before. The North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the coastal waters of West Africa. These were demanding, sometimes deadly, but they were navigable within the frameworks that European maritime tradition had developed. What waited at the bottom of Africa, and what stretched across the Indian Ocean beyond it, was something else entirely. It was a system of winds and currents and atmospheric violence on a scale that would take generations of painful, often fatal experience to understand, and that would, over the roughly 150 years of Portugal's dominance of the India route, send hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men to the bottom of seas they had never expected to sail. But in the summer of 1487, none of that was yet fully known. What was known was that King João II had dispatched a fleet of 3 ships under the command of Bartolomeu Dias, a nobleman and experienced sailor about whose earlier life relatively little is recorded, with orders to find the southern end of Africa and discover what lay beyond it. And what Dias found, and what it cost him to find it, and what it revealed about the nature of the route, set the pattern for everything that followed. The fleet that Bartolomeu Dias led out of Lisbon in August of 1487 was small by the standards of what would follow: 3 vessels, 2 caravels and a supply ship, carrying perhaps 90 men between them. It was not a commercial voyage. There was no expectation of returning laden with spices or gold. This was a reconnaissance mission, pure exploration in the most demanding sense, pushing into coastline that no European had ever seen, and attempting to answer a question that had been hanging over the entire Portuguese project for decades. Did Africa have an end, and could you sail around it? Dias moved down the African coast with reasonable speed, following the route that earlier expeditions had established. He set up stone markers, padrões, carved with the Portuguese royal arms and the date, at strategic points along the way, claiming the coast in the name of his king and leaving records of his passage. The known world peeled away behind him as he moved south past the trading settlements his predecessors had established, past the mouth of the Congo River, past the Portuguese fort at São Jorge da Mina, and then into waters that were, for European sailors, genuinely unknown. By the time he reached what is now the southern coast of Namibia, Dias was well past any point that Portuguese ships had previously reached. The coastline was becoming more hostile. The cold Benguela Current, which flows northward along the southwest African coast, brings nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean and creates some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. But the conditions it generates are punishing. Cold, foggy, with contrary winds that piled up against the coast and made the whole stretch feel, to men who did not know how far they still had to go, like sailing toward the edge of the world. The crew was growing restless. They had been at sea for months. The supply ship had been left behind at what is now Luderitz Bay in Namibia, with a small crew to guard it, and the 2 caravels pressed on alone. Then, in early January of 1488, a storm found them. What Dias encountered off the southern tip of Africa was not simply bad weather in the European sense. A few days of high winds and choppy seas that a good sailor could manage with care. It was a sustained, violent gale of the kind that the Southern Ocean generates with a regularity and intensity that has no equivalent in the North Atlantic. The storms of the roaring forties, that band of latitude between 40 and 50 degrees south, where no continental landmass interrupts the circulation of wind around the globe and the ocean swells, build unchecked for thousands of miles, are among the most powerful weather systems on the planet. Waves can reach heights of 15, 20, even 30 meters under the right conditions. The wind doesn't gust and ease in the way that European sailors were accustomed to. It howls continuously for days, and the pressure it creates on sails and rigging can destroy a ship as efficiently as any rock. Dias ran before the storm for 13 days, driven steadily southward, and then, as the storm shifted, westward and then northward again. When the weather finally eased and he was able to take a bearing, he discovered that he was no longer seeing the African coast to his east. He had, without realizing it, been swept around the southern tip of the continent entirely. He turned east, then north, and eventually found himself sailing along a coast that was running from west to east, not north to south as the African coast had been doing. He had reached what is now Mossel Bay on the southern coast of South Africa, and the Indian Ocean was ahead of him. What Dias had found was extraordinary, and he knew it. But his crew had been at sea for the better part of 6 months, in conditions of extreme hardship and constant danger, and they were not inclined to celebrate. They wanted to go home. A council of officers was held, a tradition among Portuguese explorers when decisions of this magnitude needed to be made, and though Dias reportedly wanted to press on toward India, the consensus was against him. They turned back. On the return voyage, approaching the tip of Africa from the east for the first time in daylight and calm conditions, Dias saw clearly what he had rounded in the storm, a jagged dramatic headland jutting south into the sea, with the two oceans meeting in white chaos around it. He named it Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. King João, with an eye for public relations and for the significance of what had been accomplished, renamed it Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope. Because what it represented was exactly that, the hope that the route to India was real, and that it was merely a matter of time and preparation before someone sailed all the way through, that someone would not be Dias himself. He returned to Portugal with his discovery intact, reported to the king, and then spent years in a kind of professional limbo, honoured but not employed on the great follow-up voyage that his discovery had made possible. That voyage went instead to Vasco da Gama, for reasons that remained somewhat obscure but likely had to do with court politics, da Gama's connections to the royal family, and possibly his reputation as a man of particularly hard and determined character, qualities that João's successor, King Manuel I, evidently believed the voyage required. Dias was assigned a supporting role, accompanying the fleet as far as the Cape Verde Islands before returning, watching another man collect the glory for the completion of his work. But even as the preparations for the da Gama voyage were underway, Dias was working on something else that would prove to be of immense importance to the ships that followed, the design and construction of the vessels that would actually make the India run. He spent time at the shipyards at Lisbon and at the naval base at Setúbal, consulting on the construction of the Naus, the large round-hulled carracks, that would become the standard vessel for the Carreira da Índia, the India route. He understood better than almost anyone alive what those ships would face because he had faced it himself. He knew about the southern swells, the contrary currents, the storms that lasted for weeks, and the ships he helped design reflected that knowledge, heavier and sturdier than anything that had preceded them, built for endurance rather than speed, capable of carrying the large crews and substantial armament that the commercial and military realities of the route would require. Dias himself eventually returned to the Southern Ocean in 1500 as captain of one of the ships in the fleet of Pedro Álvares Cabral, a fleet that, in the course of its outbound voyage to India, accidentally discovered Brazil before rounding the Cape and proceeding east. But Dias never reached India. On May 24th, 1500, 4 of Cabral's ships were caught by a catastrophic storm south of the Cape of Good Hope, the same waters where Dias had made his discovery 12 years earlier, and went down with all hands. The man who had first shown Europe the way around Africa was killed by the ocean he had been the first to conquer in sight of the very headland he had named, and that bore the name of a hope he had helped create. There is something in that particular irony that feels almost too perfect to be accidental, as though the Southern Ocean were enforcing some private accounting of its own. The storm that killed Dias killed not just 4 ships but hundreds of men, and it was only the first in a long series of catastrophes that would define the history of the India route, because what Dias had found, and what da Gama would exploit, and what generations of Portuguese sailors would attempt and frequently fail to survive, was not simply a geographical feature, a cape to be rounded, a route to be followed. It was an encounter with a set of oceanic conditions so fundamentally different from anything in European maritime experience that the existing knowledge, the existing ship designs, and the existing navigational traditions were simply inadequate to the task. The Atlantic was dangerous. The Mediterranean was treacherous, but the Southern Ocean and the Indian Ocean beyond it operated according to rules that no one in Lisbon or Porto had yet learned, and the learning of those rules would cost, over the course of a century and a half, a staggering toll in ships and lives. To understand why, you have to understand something about the physics of the world's oceans, and specifically about the way that wind and water interact across the vast stretches of open sea that surround the southern tip of Africa, because the Cape of Good Hope is not just a dramatic piece of geography. It is the meeting point of two of the most powerful ocean systems on the planet, and what happens at that meeting point is, to a wooden sailing ship trying to navigate it, something very close to a natural disaster waiting to happen. And the man who would be the first to sail deliberately into that disaster, with full knowledge of what Dias had found and a mandate to push all the way through to India, was already waiting in Lisbon. On July 8th, 1497, a fleet of 4 ships cleared the mouth of the Tagus River at Lisbon and turned south into the Atlantic. The moment was witnessed by enormous crowds on the shore. The city had been building toward this departure for years, and there was a sense, even among people who could not fully articulate it, that what was happening was significant beyond the ordinary run of royal ventures. A mass had been held the night before at the little chapel of Restelo near the water's edge, and the sailors had spent the night in prayer. Whatever else Vasco da Gama was, and he was many things, not all of them admirable, he was about to attempt something that had never been done, a continuous sea voyage from Europe to India, following the African coast around its southern tip and across the open Indian Ocean to the Malabar coast of what is now Kerala. The fleet consisted of 4 vessels. The flagship was the San Gabriel, a nau of perhaps 120 tons, commanded by da Gama himself. Its sister ship, the São Rafael, was commanded by his brother Paulo. The Berrio was a smaller caravel, faster and more manoeuvrable, commanded by Nicolau Coelho, and there was a 4th vessel, a supply ship whose name has not been definitively recorded, sometimes called the São Miguel, carrying provisions, spare parts, and trading goods, which would be stripped and burned at the Cape Verde Islands, or possibly further along the coast, its cargo distributed among the other 3 ships, and its crew absorbed. The total number of men who sailed on the fleet has been estimated at between 148 and 170, though the records are imprecise. What is known is that a significantly smaller number returned. Da Gama's route, as he had planned it, with advice from Dias and from the pilot Pero de Alenquer, who had sailed with Dias on the 1487 voyage, was not the simple coastal route that previous expeditions had followed. Rather than hugging the African shore all the way south, which would have meant fighting the Bengala Current and the contrary winds that plagued the southwest African coast, da Gama made a daring decision to swing far out into the Atlantic, taking advantage of the trade winds in a broad loop that would eventually bring him back to the African coast near the Cape. This outward swing, which took the fleet into waters where no European ships had ever sailed, lasted approximately 93 days. 93 days at sea without sight of land, a duration that was by far the longest open ocean passage any European fleet had yet attempted. Even Columbus's famous first crossing of the Atlantic in 1492, which had scandalized the sailors of its day with its length and uncertainty, had lasted only 33 days. The crossing was not uneventful. The fleet encountered calms that left them motionless for days at a stretch, baking in equatorial heat with the provisions slowly working their way through the stores. They encountered squalls that came up quickly and with violence, requiring the crews to scramble aloft in darkness and driving rain to take in sail. And they encountered the psychological pressure of genuine isolation. 3 small wooden ships in an ocean that no European had crossed in this direction, with no charts, no landmarks, and no certainty that their calculations of position were correct. The pilots navigated by latitude, using the stars and the sun and the tools of celestial navigation that Portuguese sailors had been refining for decades, the quadrant, the astrolabe, the kamal borrowed from Arab navigators. But celestial navigation tells you where you are in terms of your distance from the equator. It does not tell you where you are in terms of your distance from your destination, or what currents might have pushed you off your intended course. They made landfall at St Helena Bay on the southwestern coast of South Africa in early November of 1497, roughly 4 months after leaving Lisbon. The encounter with the local Khoikhoi people was tense and confused. There was a brief violent confrontation in which da Gama was himself slightly wounded by a thrown spear, one of the relatively few times in his career that he was physically endangered by another person rather than by the sea. They watered the ships, made repairs, and moved on south toward the Cape. The rounding of the Cape of Good Hope took place in late November of 1497. The weather, compared to the storm that had overwhelmed Dias 9 years earlier, was relatively mild. Da Gama's timing was better, or he was simply luckier, or the Cape's moods are sufficiently variable that one passage can be entirely different from another made in the same season. But relatively mild in the context of the Southern Ocean, is not the same as calm. The swells that roll up from the south are never entirely absent at the Cape. Even on good days, the sea there has a restlessness, a barely suppressed violence that is palpable to anyone on a ship's deck. The sailors who went aloft to manage the sails as the fleet worked around the headland would have felt the cold spray, seen the rocks of the Cape itself dark and dramatic against the sky, and known that they were the first men of their world to make this crossing with full knowledge of what they were doing and where they were going. Beyond the Cape, everything changed. The Indian Ocean, which opens up to the east once you round the tip of Africa and begin moving up the eastern coast of the continent, is a different world from the Atlantic. The monsoon system, the great seasonal reversal of winds that blows from the southwest in summer and the northeast in winter, dominates the circulation of the entire ocean basin, and it is a system that Arab and Indian sailors had been exploiting for commerce for 2,000 years. The dhows of the Swahili coast, the vessels of the Gujarati merchants, the ships of the Arab traders who connected East Africa to India and beyond, they all moved according to the logic of the monsoons, waiting for the right season to make the crossing in either direction, their entire commercial existence organised around the wind patterns of an ocean they understood intimately. Da Gama's fleet arrived on the eastern African coast without this knowledge, but found, at the Arab trading towns of Mozambique and Mombasa and Malindi, a living infrastructure of maritime commerce that could, if approached correctly, provide what they needed. The reception was mixed, to put it diplomatically. At Mozambique, the local ruler initially received them with some warmth, under the mistaken impression that they were Muslims. When the misunderstanding became clear, relations deteriorated sharply. At Mombasa, they were nearly ambushed and the fleet barely escaped. But at Malindi, the Sultan was willing to negotiate, partly because he had his own political reasons to be friendly with anyone who might be an enemy of the Mombasa Sultan, and it was there that Da Gama acquired the most important single asset of the entire voyage, a pilot who knew the Indian Ocean. The identity of this pilot has been debated for centuries. Portuguese sources refer to him as a Moor, a generic term in their usage for Muslim, from Gujarat in what is now Western India. Some later accounts, and some modern scholars, have identified him with the great Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, whose written works on Indian Ocean navigation survive, and who was regarded as the supreme authority on those waters in his era. The identification is disputed, and most contemporary historians consider it unlikely, but it captures something true about what Da Gama found at Malindi. Not just a pilot, but access to a tradition of maritime knowledge, charts, star tables, knowledge of the monsoon calendar, understanding of the currents that had been accumulated over millennia and that made the crossing of the Indian Ocean from Africa to India not just possible but relatively straightforward for those who understood it. The fleet made the crossing in 23 days, arriving off the Malabar coast of India, near the city then known as Calicut, now called Kozhikode, in the state of Kerala, on May 20th, 1498. The total voyage from Lisbon had taken 10.5 months. They had sailed approximately 24,000 miles, and the reaction of the Zamorin, the Hindu ruler of Calicut, who received Da Gama with the elaborate courtesy that his court required, was, once the initial curiosity had passed, something between polite puzzlement and barely concealed amusement. What Da Gama had brought to trade, cloth, sugar, olive oil, goods that were regarded as entirely routine in Europe, and that he had clearly expected to create excitement, were simply not impressive in a market that had been trading with the Arab world, with China, with Persia and East Africa for centuries. The Arab merchants who dominated the trade at Calicut were hostile and suspicious of these strange new arrivals, who seemed to want to cut into their business. The negotiations were frustrating, the trading was poor, and Da Gama spent months trying to establish the kind of commercial relationship that he had been sent to create, with only partial success. But he had done it. He had proven the route. He had connected Europe to India by sea for the first time in recorded history. And when he finally turned his ships back toward the west in late August of 1498, the significance of what he had accomplished was written in the goods that filled the holds of his ships, modest in quantity because the trading had gone poorly, but sufficient to demonstrate the principle: pepper, cinnamon, ginger. The things that Europe desperately needed, that the Portuguese crown needed to control, that the entire geopolitical logic of the preceding decades had been building toward. He had found them. He had reached them by sea without touching Ottoman territory, without passing through Arab or Venetian hands. The world was different now. The return voyage very nearly killed him. The crossing from India back to Africa, sailing against the southwest monsoon rather than with it, took 3 months instead of 3 weeks. Without the pilot, who had returned to Malindi, da Gama attempted the crossing at the wrong season, and the fleet was at sea in miserable conditions for the entire passage. Scurvy, which had been a problem on the outbound voyage, became devastating on the return. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, and it kills slowly and horribly. The gums soften and bleed, old wounds reopen, the joints swell with fluid, the skin bruises at the lightest touch, and eventually the body simply deteriorates to the point where it cannot sustain life. The medieval world did not understand the cause, and the Portuguese had no reliable remedy. Men died. By the time da Gama reached the East African coast and found fresh fruit and vegetables, the crews were so depleted that he had too few men to sail all 3 ships. The São Rafael, his brother Paulo's ship, was stripped and burned at the East African island of São Jorge, its crew distributed between the remaining 2 vessels. Paulo da Gama, Vasco's brother, was dying. He had contracted what the chronicles describe as a wasting illness, possibly scurvy in an advanced stage, possibly something else. And Vasco, in one of the more humanizing acts recorded in an otherwise often brutal life, diverted the fleet to the Azores rather than returning directly to Lisbon, hoping that his brother might recover with rest and fresh food. Paulo died in the Azores, in the arms of a friend da Gama sent for from Lisbon, before the fleet made its final return. He did not live to see the reception that awaited his brother, the crowds, the processions, the papal bull, the titles, the extraordinary wealth of the roughly 160 men who had sailed from Lisbon 18 months earlier. Approximately 55 returned. The rest, more than 2/3 of the fleet, were dead, most of them from scurvy, some from tropical disease, some from the violence of the encounters in East Africa and India, some simply from the accumulated hardships of the longest sea voyage any European had yet survived. And yet, by every measure that the Portuguese crown and the merchants who backed them were using to evaluate the venture, the voyage was an overwhelming success. The pepper and spices that da Gama brought back sold for 60 times what the expedition had cost. The route was proven. The geography was understood, at least in broad outline, and the floodgates opened to understand why ships kept disappearing, why the rounding of the Cape was so consistently, so catastrophically deadly over so many decades and so many voyages. You need to spend a little time with the geography of the Southern Ocean, because what goes on at the bottom of Africa is not simply bad weather. It is the convergence of several of the most powerful physical systems on the planet, operating at scales that dwarf anything in the experience of sailors trained in European waters, and their interaction produces conditions that can, and regularly did, destroy the largest and best-built wooden ships in the world. The Cape of Good Hope sits at approximately 34 degrees south latitude, not actually the southernmost point of Africa, which is Cape Agulhas, about 150 kilometers to the east, but the most dramatically projecting southern headland, and the one that sailors experienced most intensely. The waters around both capes are dominated by 2 massive oceanic features that, between them, create a uniquely violent maritime environment. The first is the Agulhas Current. The second is the influence of the roaring forties, that band of perpetually westerly winds that encircles the globe at the latitudes below 40 degrees south. The Agulhas Current is one of the great ocean currents of the world, a warm, fast-moving river of water that flows southwestward along the east coast of Africa, driven by the wind patterns of the South Indian Ocean. It is deep, narrow and powerful. At its strongest points it moves at speeds of up to 5 or 6 knots, which is faster than many sailing ships could make against the wind. As it reaches the southern tip of Africa and begins to curve around the Cape, it encounters the cold, northward-moving waters of the South Atlantic, and the collision between these 2 water masses, warm and fast from the east, cold and slower from the south and west, creates conditions of extraordinary turbulence. The temperature difference between the 2 bodies of water can be dramatic, sometimes more than 10 degrees Celsius across a boundary just a few kilometers wide, and the turbulence at that boundary generates confused seas, unpredictable currents, and sudden weather changes that can surprise even modern vessels with navigation equipment their Portuguese predecessors could never have imagined. But the most immediately deadly feature of the Cape waters is the wave system. the Southern Ocean, in those latitudes below 40 degrees south, is the only place on Earth where wind can blow continuously around the entire globe without encountering any land. The roaring 40s and the even more violent 50s and 60s run their wind around a loop of open water, and as that wind blows day after day, season after season, it generates swells. Ocean swells are not the short, choppy waves of coastal waters. They are long, organised trains of energy moving through the water, and in the Southern Ocean they build to sizes that are genuinely enormous. Waves of 10 metres, 30 feet, are not uncommon in the Southern Ocean swell system. Waves of 20 metres are observed, and when those long, powerful swells reach the continental shelf around the southern tip of Africa and encounter the opposing flow of the Agulhas Current, something extraordinary and terrifying happens. The waves slow down, steepen, and grow. This is the mechanism that produces rogue waves, the legendary walls of water that sailors have reported since the earliest days of the Cape route, and that were dismissed as exaggeration or superstition for centuries until modern satellite technology confirmed that they are real, that they occur with a frequency that was genuinely alarming to oceanographers, and that they are specifically concentrated in the Agulhas Current region. A rogue wave, technically defined as a wave more than twice the height of the surrounding sea state, can appear with very little, warning out of what seems like manageable conditions. It can reach heights of 30 metres, it has a nearly vertical face, and it can strike a ship with a force measured in hundreds of tons per square metre. A wooden sailing ship of the 15th or 16th century, no matter how well built, had essentially no prospect of surviving such an impact. The Portuguese navigators of the early 16th century did not know about rogue waves in the scientific sense. They had no framework for understanding the physics of what was killing their ships. What they had was experience, accumulated at enormous cost, and the gradually developing body of practical knowledge about when and how to round the Cape that was encoded in the sailing instructions, the roteiros, that experienced pilots wrote and shared and argued about. They learned that the Cape was more dangerous in certain seasons than others, that the winter storms of June and July were particularly violent, that the passage was generally more manageable from August to January when the wind patterns were more favourable. They learned that it was better to give the Cape a wide berth, passing at a distance of 50 or 100 miles rather than hugging the coast, to avoid the worst of the current interference. They learned to fear the appearance of certain cloud formations, certain shifts in wind direction, certain peculiarities of the swell pattern that preceded the worst conditions. But they also learned, through 100 catastrophes, that none of these precautions were sufficient to guarantee safety. The Cape killed ships that were well prepared, well crewed, and well navigated. It killed ships in fair weather and ships in storms. It killed ships whose captains were experienced veterans of multiple India voyages and ships whose captains were making their first passage. It killed ships in convoys and ships sailing alone. The only consistent variable that affected a ship's chances at the Cape was luck, and luck, over the course of many voyages, worked out to a statistical regularity that the Portuguese crown learned to account for as simply part of the cost of doing business. There was another feature of the Cape environment that compounded the danger: the coast itself. The southwestern tip of Africa is rocky and largely inhospitable, with few natural harbours and a shoreline that offers almost no refuge for a ship in distress. A vessel driven toward the coast by wind and current had, in most stretches of the Cape region, no option but to try to maintain sea room, to keep enough distance from the rocks to manoeuvre, and if that effort failed, the ship was lost. The wreck sites that modern marine archaeologists have identified along the South African coast are concentrated in certain predictable areas, around Cape Point itself, along the rocky shores near Hout Bay and Table Bay, at the few points where the geography gave ships no choice but to pass close to danger, and the pattern of those wrecks tells a story about the relationship between ocean physics and ship design that is, in retrospect, heartbreaking in its clarity. The naus of the Carreira da Índia were not small ships. By the standards of the 16th century, they were among the largest ocean-going vessels in the world, gradually growing over the decades from the 120-ton vessels of da Gama's first voyage to the great naus of the later period that could displace 1,000 or even 1,500 tons, carrying several hundred men and enormous cargoes of spices and other goods, and those large ships were, in the specific conditions of the Cape waters, actually more dangerous than smaller ones. A large now, once it was in the grip of the Agulhas Current and fighting against adverse winds, was like a building trying to navigate a river. The currents and the swells pushed it toward the coast with forces that its sails could not fully overcome. A smaller, more manoeuvrable vessel could find sea room. A raw soon, great loaded nor, sluggish from months of provisioning and poorly trimmed from a badly managed cargo, might simply be unable to work free. And there was one more factor, perhaps the most important of all, and the one that the historical record documents with the most painful clarity: the condition of the ships themselves and the men who sailed them. The India voyage was not a single passage from Lisbon to Calicut and back. It was a journey of 18 months to 2 years, covering 40 or 50,000 miles in the most demanding ocean conditions on Earth, in ships that had been built to a budget, that were often improperly maintained, that were consistently overloaded with cargo beyond their designed capacity, and that were crewed by men who were frequently sick, malnourished, and, by the time they returned to the Cape on the homeward leg, physically depleted to a degree that made them barely capable of the hard physical work that sailing required. In 1497, when Vasco da Gama first rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the Portuguese had no real system for the India trade, only the knowledge that such a system was now possible and urgently necessary. What developed over the next several decades, through a mixture of deliberate planning and pragmatic adaptation, was the Carreira da Índia, the India route, a regular commercial and military connection between Portugal and its growing empire in Asia, organised and funded by the Portuguese crown, and operated through a combination of royal ships and licensed private vessels. It was, at its height, one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings in the history of European commerce, and built into its structure, accepted as an unavoidable cost of doing business, was a rate of loss that in any other context would have been considered catastrophic. The fleet that left Lisbon annually for India, the Armada de India, typically departed in late winter or early spring, usually in late February or March, with the goal of reaching the Cape of Good Hope before the worst of the winter storms arrived in the southern hemisphere, and then crossing the Indian Ocean on the southwest monsoon. The return voyage, ideally, would leave Cochin or Goa, Portugal's main trading bases on the Indian coast, in January before the northeast monsoon made the crossing difficult, and arrive back in Lisbon in late summer or early autumn. In theory, the entire cycle could be completed in about 18 months, allowing for time at anchor in India to take on cargo. In practice, delays accumulated everywhere. Ships were late to depart, trading was slow, repairs were needed, storms added weeks to passages that were supposed to take months, and it was not uncommon for a voyage to stretch to 2 years or more. The fleets themselves were variable in size and composition. In the earliest years, the armadas were small. Da Gama's second voyage, in 1502, consisted of 20 ships, more than most subsequent fleets. As the route became established, the typical fleet settled into something like 4 to 6 ships, though there were years when larger squadrons were assembled, and years when only 1 or 2 ships made the passage. The type of ship standardized around the large now, the great carrack, supplemented by smaller caravels and later galleons. And the crucial thing about these ships, the thing that shaped every aspect of their experience on the route, was that they were not designed and built primarily for the conditions they would face. They were designed and built primarily for the cargo they would carry. The economics of the Carreira were compelling but brutal. Spices, primarily pepper, but also cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger and mace, were the main cargo on the return voyage, and the profit margins were extraordinary. A ship that returned from India with a full cargo of pepper could expect to sell that cargo for 5, 10, or even 20 times what it had cost in India, depending on market conditions in Lisbon. The Crown, which held a monopoly on the trade in the most valuable spices, extracted enormous revenue from the Carreira. Individual investors who contracted for space on the ships, or who owned the ships outright under license from the Crown, made fortunes if their ships returned, and the captains, pilots and officers of the fleet were entitled to fixed allotments of cargo space for personal trading, which they used to build personal wealth that could transform their families' positions entirely. All of this money moved through a system that everyone involved knew was losing ships at a rate that would have been unacceptable in any other commercial context. The records are fragmentary and there is genuine scholarly debate about the exact figures, but the best estimates suggest that over the approximately 150 years of the Carreira's active operation, roughly 800 ships made the round voyage, and somewhere between 150 and 200 of them, nearly a quarter, were lost at sea or destroyed in combat. Some estimates put the loss rate higher, particularly for certain periods and certain routes. The individual voyage loss rate, the chance that any given ship setting out from Lisbon would not return, has been estimated at between 12 and 20%, depending on the period and the methodology of the calculation. These numbers are, when you sit with them, extraordinary. Imagine a commercial airline today operating with a 20% chance that each plane would not return from its flight. No regulator would permit it, no investor would fund it, no passenger would board. And yet, the Carreira da Índia continued to dispatch ships for 150 years, because the returns on the ships that did come back were sufficient to cover the losses of the ships that didn't, and because the loss of a ship, while tragic in its human dimensions, was ultimately an accounting entry in a ledger that the people making the decisions would not themselves feel. The men who sailed on the Carreira did not have a choice, in any meaningful sense. Sailors in the Portuguese maritime system, and in the maritime systems of all European powers in this era, were not free agents shopping among attractive employment opportunities. They were drawn from the poorest levels of society, agricultural labourers who had been displaced by the consolidation of land, fishermen's sons for whom the sea was the only inherited skill, convicts who were offered commutation of their sentences in exchange for service on the India ships, and the dregs of the urban poor of Lisbon and Setúbal and Porto. The officers, the fidalgo captains, the pilots, the factors, were often men of family and education, but the ordinary sailors who kept the ships running, who went aloft in storms to manage the sails, who worked the pumps when the hull was leaking, were men, for whom the voyage represented not adventure but simply the least bad option available to them. They were signed onto the ship's books, given an advance that was immediately spent on the equipment and provisions they were required to supply themselves, and they did not receive their wages until the end of the voyage, which, if the ship was lost, they would obviously never collect. They were subject to a brutal code of maritime discipline that the captain could enforce with whipping, mutilation, and death for serious offences. They were expected to perform extremely demanding physical labour in the worst conditions the ocean could produce, on a diet that grew progressively worse as the voyage stretched on, and the provisions they had started with were consumed or spoiled. The diet on the India ships was, by any nutritional standard, catastrophic. The basic provisions were ship's biscuit, a twice-baked bread that kept for months but had approximately the texture and appeal of ceramic tile, salt beef, salt pork, dried fish, lentils and beans, olive oil, vinegar and wine. Fresh water was carried in casks that inevitably became contaminated and foul over time, and the wine ration was partly a practical substitute for drinking water that was too dangerous to consume in quantity. There was no fruit, there were no vegetables, there was nothing that contained significant amounts of vitamin C, and as a consequence, scurvy was not an occasional hazard on the India ships, but an almost universal experience, one that grew worse the longer the voyage lasted. The Portuguese had a word for the combination of diseases that struck sailors on long voyages: mal de Luanda, or more commonly just a general acknowledgement that the ships returned with their crews devastated in ways that the doctors of the era could describe but not explain or prevent. The relationship between fresh fruit and the prevention of scurvy was actually identified empirically by Portuguese sailors. Relatively early, the practice of stocking up on oranges and lemons when possible was well understood by the mid-16th century, but the knowledge was inconsistently applied, not universally accepted among physicians who had their own competing theories about the cause of the illness, and practically impossible to maintain on a voyage of 18 months when fresh citrus would simply not last. The result was that every long India voyage was a race against the clock of nutritional depletion, and the ships that were delayed, by storms, by calms, by extended stops in port, by any of the 1,000 things that could add weeks or months to a passage, tended to arrive at their destinations with their crews in states of physical exhaustion and illness that compromised their ability to navigate dangerous waters at exactly the moments when navigation was most critical. And then there was the issue of the ships themselves, their design, their construction, and the conditions in which they were built and maintained. The great naus of the Carreira were impressive vessels by the standards of their time, but they were built to a consistent set of compromises that, when examined closely, reveal the priorities of a commercial system that valued cargo capacity over seaworthiness and speed of construction over quality of materials. The Portuguese shipbuilding industry of the 16th century was under enormous pressure. the demand for ships, both for the India trade and for the Atlantic fisheries and coastal commerce, was constant, and the supply of suitable timber, particularly the great curved timbers that formed the ribs and keel of a large no, was limited and expensive. The forests of Portugal had been under pressure for decades. Good shipbuilding timber required centuries to grow, and the rate at which it was being consumed far exceeded the rate at which it could be replaced. The result was that ships were increasingly built from wood that was too young, too green, or of the wrong species for the purpose, and ships built from inferior timber were weaker, more prone to rot, and shorter lived than ships built from properly seasoned oak and other traditional materials. The overloading of the naus was also systematic and essentially deliberate. The space in the hold was enormously valuable. Every additional pound of pepper that could be squeezed into a ship's hold represented additional profit for someone, and the pressure to load ships beyond their safe capacity was constant. Captains and cargo managers routinely exceeded the ship's rated capacity, stacking goods on the upper decks, in the rigging spaces, in every available void. A deeply laden nau rode low in the water, was slow to respond to the helm, and was less stable than a properly trimmed vessel, all of which made her more vulnerable to the sea conditions she would encounter. There were royal regulations specifying maximum loads for India ships, and they were routinely violated. The combination of these factors, a difficult route, improperly built ships, overloaded and poorly maintained, crewed by men who were sick and exhausted, created a system that was, structurally, a machine for producing shipwrecks. And the wrecks it produced were not clean, quick catastrophes. They were often slow, terrible, drawn-out affairs in which the crew had time to understand exactly what was happening to them, time to pray and to fight and to make impossible choices before the sea finally took the ship. There is a remarkable body of Portuguese literature that grew directly out of the disaster of the India route. Beginning in the mid-16th century, survivor narratives from the wrecks of the Carreira da Índia began to be collected, published and read by the Portuguese public, with something that blended fascination, horror, and a complex kind of national pride. These narratives, the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas, as they were eventually, collected and titled, are among the most vivid and detailed records of maritime disaster ever produced, and they describe, in language of sometimes extraordinary power, what actually happened when the system's structural violence finally manifested in the specific, irreducible experience of people dying on a wrecked ship. The wreck of the São João, which went down on the coast of South Africa in June of 1552, is one of the best documented and in many ways most representative of the disasters that befell the Carreira. The São João was a large nau, probably around 500 tons, outward bound from Lisbon to India when she was caught by a storm off the coast of what is now KwaZulu-Natal and driven ashore. The captain was Manuel de Sousa Sepúlveda, a fidalgo of good family and some experience, and among the passengers was his wife, Leonor de Sá, and their children, a detail that would make the subsequent narrative particularly intense, since she was one of the very few women to figure prominently in the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas, and her fate became a kind of emblem for everything that the wreck literature was trying to process. The São João ran aground in heavy surf on a stretch of coast that offered no natural shelter and no prospect of rescue. Of the original company of around 500 people on board, approximately 300 made it to shore, a higher initial survival rate than many Cape wrecks, reflecting both the relative accessibility of the beach and the efforts of the crew and officers to organise an orderly evacuation. But surviving the shipwreck was, as it turned out, only the beginning of the ordeal. The coast where they landed was deep in territory that the Portuguese had no maps of and no relationships with, the homeland of Nguni-speaking peoples who were not immediately hostile but who were also not prepared to offer unconditional assistance to several hundred hungry, armed, frightened strangers who had just appeared on their coast. Sepúlveda organised the survivors into a marching column and began moving north along the coast, trying to reach the Portuguese trading post at Sofala, in present-day Mozambique, which was approximately 1,000 miles away. The march lasted for months. Supplies ran out quickly. People died of hunger, of disease, of exhaustion, of violence. There were encounters with hostile groups along the way, raids on the column, attacks that left men dead and goods stolen. The party shrank steadily. Leonor de Sá, who had begun the march with a dignity and fortitude that the survivor who wrote the account clearly found worthy of extended description, grew weaker. Her children died one by one. When she herself died, the account says that she refused to die dressed, stripping herself of her remaining clothing and lying exposed on the ground as a kind of final expression of humiliation and defiance, a detail that later writers would turn into a symbol of Portugal's national tragedy on the sea routes. Sepúlveda himself survived the initial march but died shortly before the remnant of the party finally reached Portuguese territory. Of the 500 or so people who had made it ashore after the wreck, fewer than 25 made it to safety. The rest, more than 475 people, died on the march, in the bush, on the coast of southern Africa, in a disaster that the account describes with a relentlessness that is almost too much to read. The São João narrative was one of the earliest and most widely read of the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas, and it set the tone for the entire genre. The wrecks were not simply accidents. They were events of national and even cosmic significance, trials visited upon the Portuguese people for reasons that the writers struggled to understand and articulate. The Santiago, which wrecked in 1585, offered a variation on the same pattern. This was a homeward-bound vessel, carrying a cargo of pepper and spices from Goa, already on the last leg of a voyage, that had apparently gone well until the storm found her near the Cape. The wreck happened at night, in conditions of poor visibility, when the ship struck rocks that the pilot had either miscalculated or simply not seen in time. The impact destroyed the hull quickly. The rocks tore through the bottom planking in a way that made pumping useless within minutes, and the ensuing chaos on deck as hundreds of men tried to save themselves from a sinking ship, in darkness and rough water, was, by the account of the survivors, something beyond the capacity of ordinary language to describe. What distinguished the Santiago disaster, in terms of its documentary value, was the survival of a relatively detailed account of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the wreck. The decisions made about who would have access to the ship's boats, the conflicts between officers and sailors about the priority of cargo versus lives, the deaths in the water of men who could not swim or could not make it to the shore through the surf, and then the long ordeal of the survivors on the coast, once again on the South African shore, once again moving north through territory they did not know, toward a settlement that was impossibly far away. The Santiago narrative is less dramatic in its human detail than the São João story. There is no Léonore de Serres to focus the reader's emotion, but it is in some ways more useful as a document, because it records more of the practical and logistical dimensions of the disaster. What food they had, what weapons, what tools, how they organised themselves, who led and who followed, and who, when things became desperate enough, simply stopped. The wreck of the Santo Alberto in 1593 is perhaps the most extraordinary of the documented Cape disasters, because it is the one that produced both the most detailed survivor narrative and the most successful outcome. The Santo Alberto was also homeward bound, carrying pepper and other goods from India, and she wrecked on the coast of what is now the eastern Cape of South Africa, after a storm pushed her onto the rocks near what the Portuguese called the Ponta da Pescaria, the fishing point. The captain was Nuno Velho Pereira, and what he did in the aftermath of the wreck became a model of the kind of leadership that the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas consistently celebrated but rarely actually documented. Pereira landed approximately 125 men from the wreck, a relatively small party since the Santo Alberto had not been fully crewed, and organised them with a discipline and care that the subsequent narrative attributes to his combination of military experience, personal authority, and genuine Christian virtue. He established order, divided the work, managed the provisions carefully, negotiated with the local people, with a combination of firmness and respect that avoided the violent confrontations that had destroyed earlier parties, and led the march north along the coast. The entire journey, covering roughly 1,000 miles of difficult terrain, took approximately 5 months, and when the party finally reached Lourenço Marques, present-day Maputo, in late 1593, 98 of the original 125 men were still alive. By the standards of the India Route's disaster literature, this was an almost miraculous survival rate, and Pereira was celebrated accordingly. The narrative written about the Santo Alberto is the most optimistic of the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas. It reads, at times, almost like a military manual for how to survive a shipwreck, and it provides a kind of counterpoint to the more typical narratives of complete catastrophe. What unites all of these accounts, and what gives the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas their peculiar power as a body of literature, is the way they document the relationship between the grand ambitions of the Portuguese Empire and the individual human lives that were consumed in its service. The captains and passengers of these ships, the fidalgos, the merchants, the soldiers, were often people of education and some sophistication, capable of articulating their experience in language that went beyond mere complaint or recitation of events. They understood, in ways that the architects of the Carreira system perhaps chose not to dwell on, that they were the expendable components of a machine that had been built for profit. The sea that killed them was not malicious. It was simply indifferent, operating according to its own enormous logic, and the ships and men and systems that had been sent out to master it had, in many crucial respects, simply failed to be adequate to the task. Not every ship that failed to return from India was sunk by the sea. Some of them were taken, captured, boarded, stripped of their cargo, their crews killed or enslaved or ransomed, their hulls either sunk or repurposed. The Indian Ocean was not an empty space awaiting European arrival. It was already one of the most commercially active maritime environments in the world, crisscrossed by the trading networks of Arab merchants, Swahili city-states, Indian merchant guilds, Malay traders, and Chinese commercial expeditions that had been operating for centuries. Into this existing world, the Portuguese had arrived with a program of commercial domination backed by military force that was both strikingly effective in some respects and catastrophically counterproductive in others. The early Portuguese approach to the Indian Ocean trade was essentially piratical, in the sense that they used their superior artillery to attack and seize ships belonging to existing merchants, to bombard port, cities that refused to deal with them on Portuguese terms, and to establish a system of passes, cartazes, which they issued to ships trading in Indian Ocean waters, and without which a vessel could be treated as a legitimate prize. This system, which amounted to a protection racket operating at an oceanic scale, generated enormous revenue for the Portuguese crown in the short term, and created a permanent state of hostility with essentially every established trading community in the Indian Ocean world. The Arab merchants who had dominated the trade between India and the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, and who had been the conduit through which spices reached the Mediterranean world before the Portuguese arrived, were not simply going to accept the loss of their livelihood without response. From the earliest years of the 16th century, the merchants of Gujarat, the traders of Calicut, the sultans of the Red Sea ports, and the Mamluk rulers of Egypt organised resistance to Portuguese maritime domination. They commissioned warships, recruited experienced sailors, and fought back. The first great naval battle of this conflict was at Chaul in 1508, where a combined Mamluk Gujarati fleet defeated a Portuguese squadron and killed its commander, Lourenço de Almeida, the son of the Portuguese viceroy. The Portuguese exacted revenge at the Battle of Diu in 1509, where Francisco de Almeida crushed the Alliance fleet in one of the most decisive naval engagements in the history of the Indian Ocean. But the conflict continued in smaller, less dramatic forms for decades. What this meant practically for the ships of the Carreira da Índia was that the dangers they faced were not only oceanic. A vessel that survived the Cape, crossed the Indian Ocean safely, conducted its trading at Cochin or Goa or Calicut, and then turned homeward was not out of danger simply because it was at sea. The Red Sea approaches, the waters around Hormuz, the Malabar coast itself, were all contested. Portuguese vessels that were separated from their convoys, that were damaged by weather, or that were simply in the wrong place could be, and were, taken by opponents of every description. The records of the Carreira include not only the names of ships lost to weather, but ships lost to Arab fleets, to Malabar pirates operating from the Mapila communities of the Malabar coast, to the occasional intervention of Turkish naval forces that entered the Indian Ocean from the Red Sea and Gulf routes, and to the growing presence of European rivals who, as the 16th century progressed, had become increasingly determined to share in the wealth that Portugal had discovered. The Dutch were the most ultimately consequential of these rivals. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, was founded in 1602, and within a decade of its founding it had transformed the strategic situation in the Indian Ocean so completely that the Carreira da Índia's dominance was effectively over. The VOC was, in many respects, a more efficient machine than its Portuguese counterpart, better capitalised, more rationally organised, more willing to experiment with ship design and navigation technique, and operating with the energy of a commercial culture that had developed a genuinely modern approach to the organisation of risk. Dutch ships were, on average, better built than the overloaded naus of the Carreira. Dutch sailors were, on average, better fed and better paid, and Dutch tactics, which combined aggressive commercial competition with outright naval warfare against Portuguese interests, were devastatingly effective. The Dutch attack on the Portuguese Empire in Asia took many forms. They blockaded Goa, the Portuguese administrative centre on the Indian coast. With a consistency that disrupted supplies and communications, they established their own trading relationships with the spice-producing kingdoms of the Moluccas, offering better prices and fewer of the extortionate demands that Portuguese factors had been making for decades. They captured Portuguese vessels whenever they could, and the records of the first decades of the 17th century include numerous Portuguese ships lost not to the Cape but to Dutch prize crews. Most significantly, the Dutch established Batavia, now Jakarta, in 1619 as their Asian headquarters, and from that base they systematically dismantled the Portuguese commercial empire piece by piece over the following decades. The English were also present, through the English East India Company founded in 1600, and though they were initially less aggressive than the Dutch, their presence in the Indian Ocean contributed to the constant pressure on Portuguese shipping and the general sense that the sea routes were contested spaces rather than Portuguese highways. And there were the local powers, the rising Maratha fleet under Kanhoji Angre in the early 18th century, the Arab sailors of Oman who had their own long-standing resentment of Portuguese interference in Gulf trade, the persistent small-scale piracy of the Malabar coast, all of which meant that a Portuguese ship in the Indian Ocean was never entirely safe, never able to relax its watch, never fully secure from the possibility of sudden attack. Before the Dutch rose to dominance, there were also the Ottoman interventions in the Indian Ocean that deserve attention, because they represent one of the most extraordinary geopolitical overreaches of the 16th century, and one that, despite its ultimate failure, had profound effects on the ships and sailors of the Carreira. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent dispatched several naval expeditions into the Indian Ocean in the 1530s and 1540s, commanded by the governor of Egypt, Hadim Suleiman Pasha. These were not small or poorly equipped ventures. They involved large fleets of oared galleys and sailing vessels, carrying soldiers and artillery, with the explicit strategic goal of breaking Portuguese control of the spice routes and restoring the access to Asian commerce that the Ottoman Empire had lost when the Portuguese rerouted trade around Africa. The expeditions achieved some local successes, seizing Portuguese-held positions and supporting local rulers who were resisting Portuguese domination, but they were ultimately unable to establish a permanent Ottoman presence in the Indian Ocean against the resistance of Portuguese fortified positions and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across the distance between Egypt and the Spice Islands. But their presence added another hazard to the route. Portuguese ships that found themselves in the Red Sea approaches or the Persian Gulf during Ottoman operations were in genuine danger of capture, and the uncertainty about where Ottoman forces might appear was itself a kind of tactical weapon that forced Portuguese commanders to concentrate their forces in ways that limited their commercial operations. The English East India Company's own losses on the route to India, as it developed its own version of the Carreira in the 17th and 18th centuries, added another layer to the history of disappearing ships. English East Indiamen, the large well-armed merchantmen that the company used on the Cape route, were better built and better maintained than the naus of the Portuguese Carreira, and the English had the advantage of Portuguese experience to learn from, but the Cape still took its toll. The wrecks of English East Indiamen along the South African coast add their own chapter to the long catalogue of maritime disaster at the tip of Africa. The Doddington in 1755, the Grosvenor in 1782, the Birkenhead in 1852. The Cape did not discriminate by nationality or flag. What gave a particular darkness to the story of ships taken by pirates or rivals compared to ships lost to weather was the question of survivors. A ship sunk by a storm might or might not have survivors, depending on the circumstances, but the sea, in its indifference, did not actively target the crew. A ship taken by hostile forces was a different matter. The fate of captured Portuguese sailors in the Indian Ocean varied enormously depending on the captor, the circumstances, the value of the crew as hostages or as labour, and the particular moment in the long cycle of violence and retaliation that characterised the Indian Ocean during the Portuguese period. Some prisoners were ransomed, eventually making their way back to Portugal with accounts of their captivity that were as harrowing in their own way as the wreck narratives. Some were enslaved, put to work in the households of Arab merchants, in the galleys of Gujarati fleets, in the growing Portuguese population of captives in the courts of Asian rulers. Some were simply killed, in reprisals for the violence that Portuguese forces had visited on local populations, or simply because keeping prisoners was inconvenient. The Portuguese crown maintained a ransom fund, a mechanism for paying the release of sailors captured in Asian waters, but the fund was chronically underfunded, and the bureaucratic process of extracting captives from distant and hostile powers was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Men who had been taken prisoner in the Indian Ocean often waited years for release, watching their chances of survival diminish with each passing season, sustained by whatever combination of faith, stubbornness, and luck had kept them alive thus far. History has a way of speaking from unexpected depths. In June of 2013, a team of marine archaeologists working off the coast of Oman made a discovery that, in its combination of historical significance and sheer physical beauty, ranks among the most important underwater finds of the modern era. At the bottom of the sea near Al-Halaniya Island, an island in the Arabian Sea that was known to the Portuguese as the island of Mascarenhas, they found the wreck of a ship that had been lying on the seafloor for more than 500 years, and when they examined the artifacts that emerged from the sediment, the corroded bronze cannon, the Portuguese coins, the navigation instruments, the personal objects of men long dead, they realized they were looking at the remains of one of Vasco da Gama's own fleet. The ship was the Esmeralda, a vessel that had sailed on da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502 and that had been lost in a storm off the Omani coast in 1503 under the command of Vicente Sodré, da Gama's uncle. The loss of the Esmeralda was recorded in the Portuguese chronicles of the period, but the location of the wreck had been unknown for 5 centuries. What the archaeologists found on the seabed was extraordinary. Bronze breech-loading swivel guns of the type characteristic of early 16th century Portuguese warships, silver coins minted in Lisbon in 1499 and 1500, an indulgence disc, a lead disc bearing a papal symbol, possibly used as a prayer token, and a personal navigation instrument, an astrolabe disc, that bore markings consistent with Portuguese manufacture from the early 1500s. The excavation of the Esmeralda wreck was painstaking, constrained by the technical difficulties of working on the seabed in open water and by the need to preserve the context of the find. The spatial relationships between objects that could tell archaeologists about how the ship had been arranged and how it had sunk. What emerged, over several seasons of diving, was a picture of a ship that had been damaged by the storm and had settled to the bottom in pieces, its wooden hull long since dissolved by the action of sea creatures and centuries of water, but its metal and ceramic objects preserved in the sediment with extraordinary fidelity. The guns, with their distinctive Portuguese casting marks, were among the earliest examples of their type ever recovered from an archaeological context, a direct connection to the very beginning of the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean. The Esmeralda discovery resonated far beyond the world of maritime archaeology because it was the first physical confirmation of a specific voyage recorded in the historical sources, a bridge between the written record and the material reality of the sea. It made real, in a way that documents alone cannot, the fact that these ships and these men had actually existed, had actually sailed across this ocean, had actually fought and died in the waters where the wreck now lay. The astrolabe disc in particular, a small corroded disc of bronze that had once been held in the hands of a Portuguese navigator trying to find his latitude in the Indian Ocean in 1503, was a kind of time capsule of the most intimate kind. A personal object that had crossed the world and then waited at the bottom of the sea for 500 years to be found. Other wrecks had been found before the Esmeralda, and others have been found since, along the various stretches of the Cape Route in the Indian Ocean. The wreck of the São Gonçalo, which sank in 1630 in the Bay of Luís Felipe, near the current South African town of Plettenberg Bay, was partially excavated in the 1970s and yielded a significant collection of Portuguese artifacts, including navigational instruments, ceramics, and personal items. The Nossa Senhora dos Mártires, which wrecked at the mouth of the Tagus itself, almost within sight of Lisbon, in 1606 on its return from India, was excavated in the 1990s and produced an extraordinary archive of the goods that were carried on the Carreira: Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, Southeast Asian spices, and the personal possessions of the crew and passengers. The process of finding these wrecks and extracting their stories from the sediment has transformed our understanding of the India route in ways that documents alone could never have achieved. The physical evidence from the wrecks tells us things about the ships themselves, their construction, their armament, the goods they carried, that the written records either omit or describe inadequately. It tells us about the personal lives of the people who sailed on them, the coins they carried, the medals they wore, the tools of their trades, and it tells us sometimes something about how they died. The distribution of artifacts across a wreck site can reveal whether a ship sank quickly or slowly, whether the crew had time to attempt salvage, whether the bodies were recovered or left where they fell. The archaeology of the Cape wrecks is particularly rich because the combination of the African coast geology, the hard, clean sand and rock of the Cape region, and the cold, clear water of the Southern Ocean has preserved many of the sites with a fidelity unusual in marine archaeology. The wreck of the Meru, a French vessel that sank in the 18th century near Cape Point, was found essentially intact, its cargo of porcelain and fine goods still in the arrangement they had been placed in the hold. The wreck of the Sacramento, a Portuguese vessel lost in 1647 near Punta de Pedras on the Brazilian coast, yielded an extraordinary collection of bronze cannon and navigational instruments that have been the subject of extended archaeological study. The stories that these wrecks tell are, in a sense, the stories that the Histórias Trágico-Marítimas were trying to tell from the other end, from the perspective of the survivors looking back at the disaster they had escaped. The wrecks tell the story from the perspective of the ship and its contents, the material culture that was left behind when the human drama ended. Together, the written narratives and the physical evidence from the seafloor construct a composite picture of the India route that is richer and more detailed than either source could provide alone. What is striking when you look at both sources together is how human the whole enterprise was, how contingent, how improvised, how driven by the mundane pressures of profit and ambition and fear, and how costly in terms of the individual lives that were ground up in its machinery. The naus of the Carreira were not symbols of invincible European power. They were wooden boxes, imperfectly built, sent out into the most demanding ocean in the world by men who understood the risks in the abstract but chose not to dwell on them, crewed by men who had no meaningful choice about whether to go. The fact that they accomplished what they accomplished, that they maintained a commercial connection across 20,000 miles of ocean for a century and a half, is genuinely remarkable. The cost at which they accomplished it is something that the historical memory of the age of exploration has sometimes preferred to overlook. The Carreira da Índia did not end on a particular date, with a particular ship or a particular disaster. It faded. The Portuguese Empire in Asia, which had been the most commercially dynamic force in the Indian Ocean world for much of the 16th century, found itself squeezed from multiple directions as the 17th century progressed by the Dutch, who captured Malacca in 1641 and effectively ended Portuguese dominance of the strait that connected the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, by the English, who established their own trading networks with increasing confidence, and by the internal decay that seems to afflict all empires eventually, a combination of overextension, corruption, and the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a system that had always cost more than it should have. The last armadas da India sailed under increasingly reduced circumstances. Fewer ships, smaller cargoes, less royal investment, more competition from rivals who had learned from Portuguese mistakes and applied that learning with ruthless efficiency. By the mid-17th century, the Carreira had become a shadow of what it had been at its peak in the middle decades of the previous century, when some 20 or 30 ships a year might make the passage, and the revenues from pepper and other spices were still sufficient to fund a substantial portion of the Portuguese state's operations. The great naus, the floating fortresses that had defined the route's character for a century, were replaced by smaller, less expensive vessels as the economics of the trade deteriorated, and the men who sailed on them were no longer the fidalgos and career officers of the earlier era, but a more miscellaneous collection of merchants, adventurers, and the simply desperate who were drawn to what remained of the India trade. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was, in terms of the geography of trade between Europe and Asia, the most significant event since Vasco da Gama's first voyage. The canal cut the distance between London and Bombay from roughly 11,000 miles via the Cape to approximately 6,200 miles via the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and it made the Cape route, which had defined global commerce for nearly 400 years, almost immediately obsolete for the high-value goods that were the point of the trade. Steam power had already been transforming maritime commerce for decades before the canal opened. The combination of reliable mechanical propulsion and a dramatically shortened route completed the transformation. Ships that could no longer round the Cape in the teeth of a storm because they would run out of coal before they arrived were now able to proceed through the canal on a schedule that was largely immune to the vagaries of wind and weather. The Cape route did not disappear entirely. It remained, and remains today, an important route for vessels too large for the canal, and for the oil tankers and bulk carriers of the modern era, which find the canal's fees less economical than the longer route for certain cargoes. But it was no longer the primary highway of global commerce, and the enormous human and material investment that had been required to develop and maintain it over the course of 4 centuries was no longer necessary. The Southern Ocean continued to take its toll. The 20th century produced its own catalogue of Cape disasters, including some of the most dramatic maritime emergencies in modern history. But the ships that now faced those waters were equipped with radar, with weather satellites, with hull designs that benefited from computer modelling of ocean forces, with satellite communication that could summon rescue from thousands of miles away. They were not guaranteed safety, but they were equipped to fight back in ways that the naus of the Carreira never could. What the Carreira da Índia and the broader history of the Cape route left behind was not simply the wrecks on the ocean floor or the survivor narratives in the libraries of Lisbon. It left behind the world. The spice trade that the Portuguese opened up by sea and that the Dutch and English and others subsequently competed for and eventually transformed was one of the principal drivers of the first truly global economy, the network of exchange that connected Europe, Asia, Africa and the Americas in a web of commerce that, however violent and exploitative in its origins, created the economic foundations of the modern world. The prices in your local supermarket, the global supply chains that bring goods from one side of the planet to the other, the container ships that move through the Suez Canal and around the Cape, all of these things have a genealogy that runs back, through complex and often dark historical pathways, to the moment when Vasco da Gama sailed around the tip of Africa and knocked on the door of a world that had not asked for him. The peoples of the Indian Ocean world, the Arab merchants, the Indian traders, the Swahili city-states, the spice-producing kingdoms of Southeast Asia, experienced the arrival of the Portuguese not as the beginning of a glorious age of exploration, but as the beginning of a century and a half of commercial extortion, military violence, and systematic disruption of trade networks that had functioned for millennia. The Carreira da Índia was built on the wreckage of their commerce as much as on the bones of Portuguese sailors. This is not a comfortable thing to hold alongside the genuine achievement of the navigation, the extraordinary seamanship, the courage, the physical and intellectual effort required to master the Cape route. But it is the truth, and the history of the route is incomplete without it. The Indian Ocean is a different ocean today than it was in 1497. Its shores have changed. The old Swahili city-states are archaeological sites now. The great Arab trading networks have been replaced by the oil economies of the Gulf. The spice kingdoms of the Moluccas are part of Indonesia. The fish that sustained the fishing communities along the Cape route are under pressure from industrial trawling that Bartolomeu Dias could not have imagined. The coral reefs that gave the Portuguese their navigational landmarks along the East African coast are bleaching in water that is warmer than it has been in recorded history. Even the Cape itself, that headland that killed so many ships, and that Dias named for the storms it generated, is experiencing changes in its weather patterns that oceanographers are only beginning to understand. But the ocean itself, in its deep structure, is what it has always been. The Agulhas Current still runs its powerful course along the East African coast. The roaring forties still drive their swells around the bottom of the world. The rogue waves that killed the naus of the Carreira are still generated by the same interaction of current and swell that has operated since before any human being set foot on a ship. On a clear winter day, standing at Cape Point and looking south into the Southern Ocean, you can still see what Bartolomeu Dias saw: the endless grey water, the white chaos where the two oceans meet, the sense of something vast and indifferent that lies beyond the horizon. And if you look closely enough, and know enough about the history of the place where you're standing, you can almost feel the presence of all those ships and all those people who came here and found the route and paid for it. The history of the Cape route, when you examine it closely enough, becomes not just a maritime history, but a history of who gets counted and who doesn't, whose suffering is recorded and whose is simply absorbed into the silence of the historical record. The ships that sank had names, because ships always have names, and names survive in archives. The captains and officers who commanded them have names too in most cases, and their ranks and lineages and careers are often documented with some care. But the ordinary sailors who crewed those ships, the men who climbed the rigging in storms, who operated the pumps in leaking hulls, who rowed the boats in the surf when a ship was going aground, these men are mostly nameless, counted in the aggregate figures that tell us that approximately so many men sailed and approximately so many returned, with the difference representing loss. This is not unique to the Carreira da Índia. It is a feature of almost all pre-modern historical documentation which recorded the activities of those with power and largely ignored those without it. But the scale of the loss on the India route and the systematic nature of the risk that ordinary sailors faced makes the silence particularly loud. We know, from the aggregate figures, that the Carreira killed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 Portuguese sailors and soldiers over the course of its operation. This is the number that emerges from the careful scholarly work of historians like C.R. Boxer and Malin Newitt, who have done the painstaking work of assembling the partial records into something approaching a complete picture. 40 to 60,000 men, over a century and a half, dying on the sea or in the aftermath of wrecks or of disease, or in the violence that attended the construction of an empire. Portugal's total population in the 16th century was approximately 1 million people. The number of men who died on the Carreira alone, not counting those who died in Portugal's African and American territories, not counting those who died in the wars that attended the empire, represents a substantial fraction of the male population of the country over the relevant period. The demographic effects of the Carreira on Portuguese society were real and lasting. A persistent shortage of labour in the agricultural regions from which sailors were recruited, a structural dependence on enslaved African labour in the Portuguese economy that was partly driven by the depletion of the free labour force, a pattern of emigration and loss that shaped Portuguese culture and collective identity in ways that persist to the present day. The saudade, the untranslatable Portuguese word for a specific kind of melancholy longing, a yearning for something absent or lost, that is sometimes described as the defining emotional key of Portuguese culture, is not simply a poetic construction or a national affectation. It has a material basis in a history of departure and non-return, a culture that sent its men to sea and did not always get them back, that built an empire on the backs of people who were mostly too poor to refuse the invitation and too far from power to have their losses properly mourned. The Indian Ocean also has its own accounting of the dead, one that runs parallel to the Portuguese record but rarely overlaps with it in the historical sources. The Arab merchants whose ships were seized and whose trading networks were disrupted, the Indian port workers who were killed in Portuguese bombardments, the Swahili townspeople whose cities were burned as punishment for insufficient compliance with Portuguese demands, the enslaved Africans transported in Portuguese ships to labour in Asian settlements and American plantations. These lives too were consumed by the machinery of the Cape route, and they too are mostly nameless in the archives, absorbed into figures and estimates rather than individual records. The discovery of the wreck sites has done something important for this larger accounting. When archaeologists find the personal effects of ordinary sailors, the simple tools, the modest devotional objects, the everyday items that a man of no particular consequence carried in his sea chest, they restore, however briefly and partially, the individuality of people who were effaced by the historical record while they were alive. The lead disc from the Esmeralda wreck, the small personal items from the São Gonçalo excavation, the domestic ceramics from the Nossa Senhora dos Martires. These are the traces of lives that the contemporary documents did not think worth recording, and their recovery is a form of justice, however limited and symbolic. There is a particular object that has stayed in the minds of many who have read about the archaeology of the Cape route, a pair of dividers, a navigational instrument for measuring distances on a chart, found in the wreck of a Portuguese vessel off the South African coast. Dividers are a simple tool, two pivoting metal arms that can be set to a specific distance and walked across a chart to measure leagues or miles. This particular pair was small, well made, and had been used extensively. The tips were worn in the way that instruments are worn when they have been handled thousands of times over many years. They were the tool of someone who navigated professionally, who spent years working charts and planning courses, for whom the dividers were as personal and essential as a craftsman's favourite chisel or a surgeon's best knife. They were found in the wreck with no identification of their owner, no way to match them to a name in the records. Just the object, on the ocean floor, speaking of a person who once held them and looked at a chart and made a decision about where to go, and who eventually went somewhere the chart could not account for, somewhere the ocean had already claimed. In all the accounts of the lost ships, of the India route, there is one figure who appears again and again, sometimes celebrated, sometimes blamed, occasionally surviving when everyone else is lost, and that is the pilot. The piloto was the navigator of the Portuguese India fleet, the man responsible for knowing where the ship was at any given moment and for making the sequence of decisions about course, speed, and route that would determine whether the ship arrived safely or became one of the entries in the Perdidos register. He was usually not the captain. In the hierarchy of the Portuguese India ships, the captain was a nobleman whose role was command and authority, while the pilot was a technical specialist, drawn from a different social class, whose knowledge was practical rather than aristocratic. The relationship between the two was sometimes harmonious, sometimes fraught, and occasionally the direct cause of disaster. The pilot's knowledge was a combination of formal training and accumulated practical experience, and in the 16th century both were essential. The theoretical basis of Portuguese navigation was the science of celestial observation, the use of the sun and stars to determine latitude, the measurement of the sun's altitude at noon to calculate position north or south of the equator, the use of the pole star when it was visible, and of the Southern Cross when the ship had rounded the Cape and entered southern hemisphere waters where Polaris sank below the horizon. The instruments the pilots used, the quadrant, the astrolabe, and from the middle of the 16th century the cross-staff or ballistilla, were essentially tools for measuring angles, and the tables of solar declination that converted those angle measurements into latitudes had been compiled through decades of systematic observation by the astronomers and mathematicians who worked for the Portuguese crown. A good pilot could determine his latitude to within half a degree, roughly 30 miles, on a clear day. What no instrument could reliably tell the pilot was his longitude, his east-west position, and this limitation was one of the fundamental sources of danger on the India route. The problem of longitude, which would not be solved until the development of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century, meant that a ship rounding the Cape could not know with precision how far east or west it was relative to the headland. A pilot who thought he had rounded the Cape with sufficient sea room and was safely in the Indian Ocean might in fact still be in the Atlantic, or might be closer to the African coast than he realized. The Cape itself, and the coastline to its east, was the killing ground for ships that misjudged their longitude, and it killed them with the straightforward efficiency of ships driven onto rocks in darkness, or poor visibility by winds and currents, whose effects the pilots could not precisely calculate. The accumulated practical knowledge of the Cape route was stored in the roteiros, the Portuguese pilot books that recorded the observations of experienced navigators and provided guidelines for making the passage safely. These were not printed charts in the modern sense. They were written descriptions of the route, supplemented by rough sketches of coastlines and harbour entrances, with notes on the currents, the prevailing winds, the appearance of the coast at various points, the depths and anchorages, and the hazards that the writer had either encountered himself or learned of from others. The roteiros were closely guarded professional secrets in the early decades of the Carreira. To share the route knowledge with a foreign power was essentially treason, and the Portuguese crown went to considerable lengths to prevent the dissemination of navigational information that might allow competitors to follow their routes. Pilots who fell into foreign hands were interrogated intensively, and those who divulged what they knew faced severe punishment if they ever returned to Portuguese territory. The most famous of the Portuguese roteiristas, the writers of roteiros, was Juan de Castro, who made the India voyage in the 1530s and subsequently wrote a series of detailed navigational accounts of the route that are among the most precise and scientifically valuable documents produced in the age of exploration. Castro was unusual among pilots in being also a man of genuine scientific education, capable of bringing not just practical experience but systematic observation to his descriptions of the route. His accounts of the magnetic variation, the difference between true north and magnetic north, which changes with location and which could throw off a pilot's compass, reading in ways that had caused numerous disasters, were among the most careful observations of this phenomenon yet made, and his roteros for the various legs of the India route were detailed enough that they could be used for navigation centuries after they were written. But Castro was exceptional. Most pilots were men of practical experience without systematic scientific training, and their knowledge, while often impressive in its accumulated depth, had the weaknesses that purely empirical knowledge tends to develop. It was good for conditions that fell within the range of what the pilot had personally experienced, and less reliable for conditions that were unprecedented or that fell outside the envelope of his prior voyages. A pilot who had made the Cape Passage 5 times and survived was genuinely valuable. He knew things about the behaviour of the current and the early signs of bad weather that no amount of reading could teach. But if his 6th passage encountered conditions that differed in important ways from his previous 5, a particularly large swell system, an unusual configuration of currents, weather that behaved differently from the seasonal norms he had learned to expect, his experience might not be sufficient to carry him through. The social dynamics of the ship affected the pilot's ability to do his job in ways that the historical record occasionally illuminates with painful clarity. The captain, as the representative of the crown and the social superior of the pilot, had the formal authority to overrule the pilot's navigational recommendations, and captains sometimes exercised that authority in ways that were, from the pilot's perspective, dangerous. A captain under commercial pressure to make port quickly might overrule a pilot's recommendation to wait for better weather, or to give a headland a wider berth. A captain with social connections to the merchants whose cargo was in the hold might push for a faster passage at the cost of navigational safety. And the pilots themselves were not always in a position to resist such pressure, being dependent on the recommendation of the captains for their future employment and aware that the formal hierarchy of the ship placed them in a position where defiance of the captain's orders could itself be treated as a serious disciplinary offence. Some of the most famous disasters of the Carreira can be traced, at least in part, to failures of this decision-making dynamic. The wreck of the São Bento in 1554 off the coast of what is now Transkei in South Africa was preceded, according to the survivor account, by a navigational dispute between the pilot and the officers about the ship's position, with the pilot arguing that they were closer to the coast than the officers believed, and the officers overruling him. They were closer to the coast than the officers believed. The ship struck in the night. Most of the crew were lost. The pilot, who had been correct, presumably died with the knowledge of having been right, which is perhaps the most bitter kind of being right that exists. The knowledge that the pilots accumulated, and that the roteros preserved, formed the foundation for the navigational traditions of all subsequent European seafaring in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch pilots who developed the VOC's navigation of the Cape route drew heavily on Portuguese experience, both from the roteros that they managed to obtain through various means, and from the Portuguese pilots whom they employed when they could, and interrogated when they captured them. The English East India Company's navigational traditions similarly borrowed from Portuguese precursors. The gradual accumulation of practical knowledge about the Cape, the seasonal patterns of wind and weather, the behaviour of the Agulhas Current, the warning signs of dangerous conditions, was, in a sense, the most valuable single product of the Carreira, more durable than any individual cargo of pepper and more lasting than the empire itself. And yet, for all that accumulated knowledge, all those roteros, all those hard-won observations, all those pilots who had made the passage and survived to write down what they had learned, there remained a category of ships that none of it could account for. Not the ships that wrecked on known rocks, not the ships taken by documented rivals, not even the ships swept onto the coast in storms whose violence was at least understandable in retrospect, but the ships that simply vanished, that left no trace at all, that slipped out of the historical record as completely as if they had never existed. Beyond the documented wrecks, beyond the ships whose names we know and whose fates we can trace in the archives, there is a category of loss that is in many ways the most haunting. The ships that simply disappeared, that left Lisbon or Goa and were never heard from again, about whose fate nothing certain is known to this day. In the age before wireless communication, before satellite tracking, before any of the technologies that allow a modern ship to report its position continuously, and that allow search and rescue services to respond to emergencies anywhere in the world, a ship that sank in the Southern Ocean often sank without leaving any evidence at all. No survivors, no wreckage washed ashore at a recognizable location, no message in a bottle, nothing except the absence of the ship itself, and the gradual transition of the waiting families from hope to acceptance. The Portuguese records note a significant number of ships as perdidos, lost, without any further specification of where or how they were lost. These are the ghost ships of the Carreira, and their mystery has a particular quality that is different from the documented disasters. We can imagine the São João wrecking on its particular stretch of coast, can trace the path of the survivors up the long coastline. But for the ships that simply vanished, somewhere between Lisbon and Goa, or somewhere between Goa and Lisbon, in an ocean that in any given year contained perhaps a dozen ships making the passage, there is no narrative, no survivor to write the account, no strand of evidence from which to reconstruct the story. The Southern Ocean is particularly good at keeping secrets. A wooden ship that sank in deep water, and much of the Southern Ocean route passes over depths of 3,000 to 4,000 metres, would leave no accessible trace. The wood would be consumed by marine organisms over the course of decades. The metal objects would corrode, the cargo would dissolve or disperse. After a sufficient span of time, the physical existence of the ship would simply cease, leaving only the record of its departure in some Portuguese archive, and the record of its non-arrival wherever it was expected. The people who vanished with it left even less. A name on a ship's manifest, perhaps a few words in a letter home that was written before departure, and that arrived after the ship had already sunk. A pension petition from a widow that records the fact of loss without the detail of how. Some of these disappeared ships may have wrecked on coastlines that were then uninhabited, their wreckage scattered across beaches that no one visited for years or decades after the event, eventually buried by sand or carried away by currents. The long coastline of South Africa, much of which was essentially unsettled by any population that maintained contact with the broader world, would have been an ideal place for a ship to disappear without leaving any trace in the documentary record. Local oral traditions along certain stretches of the South African coast preserve accounts of shipwrecks and of the strange pale men who emerged from the sea and either died on the shore or struggled inland. Accounts that probably correspond to real events, but that cannot always be matched to specific ships in the Portuguese records. Some disappeared ships may have been victims of the rogue waves that oceanographers now know to be disturbingly frequent in the Agulhas Current region. A rogue wave of sufficient size could overwhelm Anno in minutes. The structural failure that such a wave would initiate, the flooding of the lower decks, the loss of steering, the progressive breakdown of the hull under the impact forces, would not have left survivors to report what happened. A ship struck by a truly large rogue wave in deep water, far from any coast, would simply cease to be, and the ocean, vast and indifferent, would close over the wreck and continue about its business. There are also the ships that may have been taken by forces unknown to the Portuguese record, local powers or rival Europeans who captured Portuguese vessels and either killed the crews or held them in circumstances where no word reached Europe. The Indian Ocean in the 16th century was a large and complex world, and the Portuguese record of what happened in it, while extensive by the standards of its time, was far from complete. Ships that were captured and their crews absorbed into Asian or African communities, that were stripped and sunk in places where the evidence would never be found, that were taken by powers who had no reason to inform the Portuguese crown of what had happened. These too could account for some of the entries in the Perdidos column. What all these missing ships have in common, beyond their absence from the historical record, is the way they concentrate attention on the fundamental strangeness of the enterprise. The men who sailed the Carreira were going somewhere that no one in their families had ever been, on ships that might not come back, along routes that were known to be lethal, for reasons that were ultimately reducible to the profit of men who were not on the ships themselves, and they went. Year after year, generation after generation, the ships left the Tagus and turned south, and the people watching from the shore did not know, could not know, which of the small points of sail disappearing toward the horizon they would see again. There is a quality to the Southern Ocean, to the waters around, the Cape of Good Hope, that visitors and sailors remark on with a consistency that suggests it is not simply imagination. It is something about the scale of the place. The long, restless swells that come from the south and the west, the sky that seems larger and more present than it does in more sheltered latitudes, the light that bounces off water that has travelled thousands of miles without meeting any obstruction. It feels, to people who are sensitive to such things, like a place with a memory. That memory, if we can call it that, is partly the result of the extraordinary density of human experience that has been deposited in these waters over the past 5 centuries. The Cape Route was the most heavily used oceanic highway in the world for much of the period between 1497 and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Every ship that carried goods between Europe and Asia, every fleet that enforced imperial power in the Indian Ocean, every passenger who made the journey between Europe and India had to pass this point. The generations of sailors who rounded the Cape left nothing visible, nothing that can be pointed to in the way that a battlefield or a ruin can be pointed to. But the ocean floor beneath the Cape waters is scattered with the remains of their passing, and that physical reality gives the place a kind of depth that is felt even by people who know nothing about the history. The South African city of Cape Town, which grew up in the lee of Table Mountain at the northern end of the Cape Peninsula, was originally a supply station established by the Dutch East India Company in 1652, a halfway point on the route where ships could stop, resupply with fresh water and vegetables, and repair their rigging before continuing. The VOC's Jan van Riebeek, who commanded the initial settlement, had explicit orders not to found a colony, but simply to maintain a refreshment station, a resupply point for the enormous volume of Dutch East India traffic that passed the Cape. The colony that grew up around that resupply point was unplanned, the consequence of the logic of the place rather than the intention of the company, and it became, over time, a society of extraordinary complexity and ultimately of extraordinary violence as the dynamics of settlement and displacement and exploitation that the Cape Route had set in motion worked themselves out in a specific place over specific generations. The wine industry of the Western Cape region, which today produces some of the world's finest wines, was established by the VOC's settlers in the 17th century as a source of fresh provisions for the passing ships, a way of providing the vitamin C that would prevent the scurvy that killed sailors on the route more reliably than storms. The grapes were planted by farmers who had been settled at the Cape partly to grow food for the ships, and the wine they produced was loaded onto the ships as they passed, a small but real technological intervention in the death rate of the Carreira and its successors. The connection between those 17th century vineyards and the global wine trade of the present day is a direct line, a thread of consequence running from the nutritional emergency of the Cape Route to the Stellenbosch estate wines that win international awards in the 21st century. The languages spoken in the Western Cape also carry the memory of the route. Afrikaans, which developed among the European settlers and their descendants at the Cape, incorporates elements of Dutch, German, French, Malay, and various African languages, a linguistic record of the extraordinary mixture of peoples that the Cape Route deposited at this particular place. The Malay community of Cape Town, Muslim, descended from enslaved and exiled people brought from Southeast Asia by the VOC, maintains traditions of music, food, and religious practice that trace directly back to the Java and Sulawesi and Malacca of the 17th century. The names of Cape Town neighbourhoods and landmarks, Woodstock Sea Point, Hout Bay, the Bow Cap, layer together Dutch settler place naming, English colonial renaming, and older indigenous names in a geographical record of successive waves of arrival. All of this, the city, the wine, the languages, the communities, the names on the map, exist because ships came this way. Tens of thousands of ships over 400 years, driven by the logic of commerce and empire that Vasco da Gama set in motion when he first rounded the Cape and pointed his damaged fleet toward India. The wreckage of those ships is on the ocean floor. The descendants of the people who sailed on them, and of the people who were brought to the Cape as cargo, as slave labour, as bodies to be used by the system, are alive today. The food you eat has been shaped by the trade routes they maintained. The prices you pay are set by global markets that have their origins in the commercial revolution that the Cape Route enabled. The political geography of Asia and Africa was fundamentally reshaped by the interventions of the ships that used this route, in ways whose consequences are still being worked out. When we ask why so many ships disappeared on the way to India, the question seems at first to be simply about navigation, about the challenges of sailing in the Southern Ocean, about rogue waves and monsoons and inadequate ship design. And it is, in part, about those things. But it is also about something larger, about the choices that societies make when they balance profit against safety, about the gap between the people who make those choices and the people who live and die by their consequences, about the way that ambitious commercial and imperial projects create systems that are structurally indifferent to the lives of the people they consume. The ships disappeared because the ocean was powerful, and because the ships and the men in them were inadequate to its demands. But they also disappeared because the system that sent them out was designed to accept a certain level of loss as simply the cost of doing business, and because the men who made up that loss were, mostly, the kinds of men whose loss the historical record did not find it necessary to record in detail. There is a gravestone in the church of the Jerónimos monastery in Lisbon, which stands on the bank of the Tagus, at the very spot where da Gama's fleet set off in 1497, and where the survivors of the India voyages would have seen land for the first time on their return, that marks the burial of Vasco da Gama himself. He died in Cochin, in India, in December of 1524, on his third voyage to the country he had first reached 26 years earlier, still in service to the crown that had sent him, still working the route whose opening had made him, by any measure, one of the most consequential individuals in the history of the modern world. His body was initially buried in Cochin, then returned to Portugal 16 years later, at the insistence of his family, carried back across the same ocean that had defined his life, and interred in the monastery that his discoveries had helped pay for. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the man who opened the route was himself carried home on it, a final passenger on a voyage he could no longer navigate. The monastery itself was built with the proceeds of the spice trade, funded by a levy on each ship's cargo of pepper that the king extracted for the purpose. It is a building of extraordinary beauty in the Manuelan style that was the distinctive architectural language of Portugal's imperial century. All nautical ornament and Gothic grandeur. The facades are covered with ropes carved in stone, with armillary spheres and navigational instruments, with the crossed arms of the Order of Christ that da Gama's sailors wore on their sails. It is, in its way, a monument to the Cape route, to the wealth it generated, to the ambition it represented, to the faith that sustained the men who sailed it. And it stands a few hundred metres from the water, looking out toward a river that leads to the sea, in a city that was built on the proceeds of a trade that killed tens of thousands of its sailors and disrupted the lives of tens, of millions of people on the other side of the world. The monastery is still standing. The route is still there. Ships still round the Cape in the southern autumn and spring, still feel the long swells from the south, still read the weather from the behaviour of the clouds around Table Mountain, and the colour of the water where the Agulhas meets the Atlantic. And somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, in depths that may never be reached, there are ships that disappeared and were never found. Ships whose names are recorded in some archive in Lisbon, whose departures were witnessed by crowds on the bank of the Tagus, and whose arrivals were waited for and finally not expected anymore, because the sea had taken them and kept them, and the horizon they had sailed toward had simply closed behind them. There is something particular about the way maritime disappearances work on the human imagination that explains, perhaps better than any other single factor, why the story of the lost ships of the India route has such a persistent hold over historical memory. When a battle is lost, there are survivors to describe it. The ground holds the evidence, and historians can reconstruct what happened with some confidence. When a city burns, the ruins remain. But when a ship disappears at sea, it disappears completely. No ground, no ruins, no survivors, nothing but absence. The families who waited in Lisbon for ships that never came back were waiting for something that might never be explained, and they knew it. The sea offered no closure, no ritual of confirmation, no body to bury. Just the ship's name struck from the expected arrivals, a few lines in the Crown's accounts recording the loss, and the slow drift toward acceptance that no explanation was forthcoming. Fernão Mendes Pinto, the great Portuguese adventurer and writer who spent decades in Asia and wrote one of the most extraordinary travel narratives of the 16th century, described the feeling of watching a ship disappear over the horizon as a kind of small death, the end of a visual connection that no human will could restore. His account is one of many that suggest that the emotional reality of the Carreira, for the people who lived within it, was defined precisely by this quality of irreversible departure, the moment when the last sail became indistinguishable from the line of the sea and sky, and the watching was over, and whatever would happen next was entirely beyond reach. That quality of irreversibility is, in a sense, the defining characteristic of the ocean. Land changes slowly or quickly, and its changes can be understood and mapped and accounted for. The ocean is always in motion, always rearranging itself, and what it takes it can hold for centuries without giving any indication of where or how or why. The naus of the Carreira that are still on the ocean floor are surrounded by water that has moved continuously since the moment they sank, water that has circled the globe many times, that has been evaporated and rained down and evaporated again, that has no permanent memory in any physical sense. And yet the ships are still there, because the water, however restless at the surface, is profoundly still at depth, and what settles to the bottom tends to stay. The sea does not explain itself. It does not give back what it takes, except occasionally, in pieces, on beaches and in the nets of fishing boats, enough to remind us that the past is not entirely gone. The lost ships of the India route are part of the sediment of history, buried under 5 centuries of subsequent events, under the Suez Canal and the steam engine and the container ship and all the technological apparatus that has made the Cape route a matter of curiosity rather than necessity. But they are there, in the dark water, in the silence that the ocean maintains about its own history, waiting for the next lucky dive team or lucky trawl to bring some fragment of them back to the surface and restore for a moment the face of the unnamed sailor who carried this particular coin, who navigated with this particular instrument, who sailed from Lisbon on a summer morning in some year of the 16th century and did not come back. The question of why so many ships disappeared on the way to India has 100 answers, as complex as the history itself. The ocean was merciless and the ships were inadequate. The men were sick and the system was indifferent to their lives. The route was pioneered at a speed that outran the knowledge necessary to make it safe. The profits were too large and the accountability was too small. The ambitions of empires regularly exceed the endurance of the individuals they send to enact those ambitions. All of these things are true, but there is also something in the pure scale of the enterprise, the audacity of pointing a wooden ship toward an unknown horizon and trusting to navigation and faith and luck, that commands a certain involuntary respect, even in an age that has no difficulty identifying the violence and injustice that attended the whole project. Every age has its version of the India route, some enormous, costly, dangerous enterprise that a society undertakes because the rewards seem to justify the price, and that produces on one side extraordinary wealth and knowledge and connection, and on the other side a long catalogue of loss that the beneficiaries prefer not to examine too closely. The men who rounded the Cape in their overloaded nors, who fought the Agulhas Current with inadequate sails and sick crews, who went aloft in southern ocean storms in darkness and rain to save rigging that might or might not hold. They were doing what they were told to do by a world that had decided, at levels far above them, that the route was worth the cost. They were, in the most literal sense, the cost. The ships are gone. The route remains, and the ocean, which was there before the ships, arrived and will be there long after the last ship has made its final passage, continues its great circular argument with the wind, building its swells in the roaring forties, running its current along the African coast, meeting itself in white confusion at the Cape, indifferent to our history, indifferent to our accounting, indifferent to the question of who was right and who was wrong, but preserving in its cold, dark depths the physical record of everything that happened there, waiting for us to find it, one piece at a time, one wreck at a time, one small bronze disc at a time, rising from the bottom of the sea to speak for the dead,